My sister lied about me, stealing family money. After I covered her debts, I went silent, and what happened next shocked everyone. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I've always tried to do right by my family. Growing up, I learned early on that responsibility wasn't something you could negotiate. It was something you carried like a weight on your shoulders, and I've carried mine for as long as I can remember. I've worked long hours at multiple jobs, often skipping nights out or small comforts just to make sure the bills were paid, the rent was covered, and my parents didn't have to worry. Money hasn't come easy, but I've always prided myself on being financially savvy, on knowing how to stretch every dollar without ever letting anyone feel the pinch. Not because I wanted credit, but because it felt like the right thing to do. I've always believed family comes first, even when that belief left me exhausted and underappreciated. Then there's my sister, Emily. Charming, persuasive, and almost impossibly good at making everyone around her believe she's harmless. She has this way of lighting up a room, of smiling at our parents so genuinely that they forget she's asked me for another favor just yesterday. Over the years, she's leaned on me more times than I can count. Loans for rent, credit card bills, even covering overdrafts I didn't know existed until she casually mentioned them. And yet, she always thanks me with a warmth that seems sincere, at least on the surface. It's hard not to want to help someone who seems so grateful, someone who plays the role of the innocent darling to perfection. Family dynamics have never been subtle in showing their preferences. My parents, in particular, seem to see Emily through a lens of admiration and luck. She's so clever, they say. She just has that way with people. Meanwhile, my sacrifices, all the late nights and careful budgeting, are quietly assumed, almost invisible, taken for granted as if doing right by family is the bare minimum expected of me. I try not to let it sting, telling myself that the recognition isn't why I do it. It's about keeping the household afloat and making sure everyone else feels safe. But that evening, as we sat in the kitchen with the warm hum of the heater and the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air, Emily turned to me with that practiced smile. "Hey," she said casually, leaning against the counter. "I've got this money problem. Think you could help me out again?" And just like that, a small knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I hesitated for a moment, staring at her like I always do when she casually drops these little bombs. The thing is, I've done this countless times before. Pulled money from my savings, adjusted my budget, skipped something I wanted or needed, just so Emily could avoid consequences she created herself. And most of the time, she acts grateful, hugging me, smiling that practiced smile that somehow makes my chest tighten with both relief and frustration. "Of course," I said finally, forcing my voice to sound lighter than I felt. "How much do you need this time?" She gave me that look, a mix of charm and calculation, and rattled off a number that made my stomach twist. It wasn't astronomical, but it was enough to make me reconsider my own finances for the next month. I could feel the familiar pull in my chest, the tug between wanting to help and resenting the constant drain on me. I've always been the responsible one, the one who keeps everything from falling apart. And yet, moments like this make me wonder if anyone notices how much I give, how much I sacrifice. My parents, as usual, hovered in the background, completely unaware, or maybe conveniently unaware, of the tension in the room. They praised Emily's ingenuity at finding solutions to her little crises, while my own careful management of the family's finances went entirely unacknowledged. "She's so clever, isn't she?" Mom said, beaming at Emily. "Always finding a way." Dad nodded absently, sipping his coffee, as if my efforts were invisible by default. I forced a polite smile, nodding along, feeling that familiar pang of being taken for granted. As Emily explained her situation, a credit card bill she'd forgotten, a small loan that supposedly fell through, I listened carefully, pretending to assess the problem. I already knew the drill. She'd spend the money freely, then charm her way out of responsibility later. But my pride and my sense of duty got in the way. I couldn't just turn her down. Not yet. By the end of the conversation, I agreed to cover her debt again, transferring the funds immediately while she hugged me tightly, whispering, "You're the best brother ever." The warmth felt real in that moment, and I wanted to believe it. But deep down, as I watched her walk away, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the uneasy suspicion that this wasn't gratitude, this was entitlement. And in that quiet kitchen, with the hum of the heater and the faint aroma of coffee lingering, I realized the small seed of resentment was growing, though I wasn't ready to face how much it would consume me. A week later, I noticed something was off. A chunk of money had gone missing from the family account, enough to make anyone panic. My heart sank immediately, and my first thought went to Emily. It wasn't that I distrusted her completely, but patterns like this don't just appear out of nowhere. She'd been careless before, asking for money, disappearing for days, always with some excuse or another. I couldn't ignore it this time, though. The amount missing was serious, and I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just an oversight. I confronted her quietly that evening, in the living room with the soft hum of the ceiling fan above. "Emily," I said cautiously, "did you take money from the account?" Her eyes widened, genuine, or at least convincing. Shock plastered across her face. "What? No! Why would you even think that?" she said, hands raised as if defending herself against an impossible accusation. My stomach twisted. I wanted to believe her, but I also remembered the countless times I bailed her out, the little lies she'd told to cover minor things. When I mentioned the missing amount, Emily gasped dramatically, clutching her chest. "I can't believe you'd even suggest that. That's ridiculous. You've always been so paranoid," she said, her voice dripping with hurt and betrayal. She started pacing, throwing in subtle accusations about my controlling nature and implying I had financial problems of my own. My parents, hearing the raised voices, came in from the kitchen. "Oh my God, is this true?" Mom asked, looking at me with wide eyes. "You took the money?" Emily's expression was one of shock and innocence, carefully rehearsed. I froze, trying to find my words, but every glance from my parents told me they were already convinced by her performance. My heart pounded as I realized the situation was spiraling out of control. I felt humiliated, standing there in the middle of the living room, accused of something I didn't do. The very person I'd always protected, the one I'd covered for countless times, was turning my family against me with practiced ease. My head spun, chest tight, and I suddenly felt completely alone in my own house. By the time Emily left the room, still pretending to be hurt and offended, I was left in silence, staring at the floor. The familiar sense of pride in being the responsible sibling had twisted into something sharp: betrayal. And as I sank onto the couch, the weight of disbelief and shame settling on me, I realized that nothing in this house would ever feel safe or fair again. After that night, I stopped talking. Not out of guilt. God knows I didn't do anything wrong. But because every word felt useless when Emily's lies carried more weight than my truth. I went silent around her, around my parents, around everyone who had once assumed I was the reliable one. I still paid my bills, still made sure the household ran smoothly, but I refused to engage in any more explanations or justifications. Every conversation felt like walking on a tightrope, and I wasn't willing to risk another public humiliation. Emily, of course, noticed immediately. She began leaning into the silence, tossing snide comments at me in casual conversation. "Oh, don't look so grumpy," she'd say, tilting her head with that infuriatingly sweet smile. Or she'd whisper to Mom in the kitchen, pretending to be concerned about me, while painting me as paranoid or controlling. And my parents? They continued to side with her, making offhand remarks about how I needed to learn to trust and stop overreacting. The house, once familiar and warm, now felt like a trap. Every glance, every word, loaded with accusation I hadn't earned. I spent nights replaying the scene over and over, wondering how quickly Emily had spun her narrative, how effortlessly she manipulated everyone into believing her. I'd covered her debts, sacrificed time and energy for her repeatedly, and this was the thanks I got? The thought made my chest ache, but I refused to show it. Instead, I retreated into myself, burying my emotions in work, in routines, and the only thing that felt controllable: my own life. Even the simplest interactions became tests. A casual question about dinner could turn into a silent battle. A request for help could feel like a trap. The house smelled the same, the heater hummed the same, but everything else had changed. I couldn't tell if it was Emily's manipulation or my own paranoia twisting reality, but the unease was constant. That night, as I sat alone in my room, staring at the faint glow of my laptop, I realized something chilling. I wasn't powerless. I had just been silenced. And yet, beneath that thought, a small seed of anger began to grow, quiet but persistent. I knew one day it would demand attention. For now, though, I stayed silent, pretending compliance, while secretly plotting the moment when I could reclaim control. And as the house settled into an uneasy quiet, I couldn't shake the thought. Emily had won the first round, but the game was far from over. Weeks passed, and Emily's behavior escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. At first, it was subtle. Little favors she needed that I refused, knowing I had no obligation to keep bailing her out after the accusations. But each time, She made sure Mom and Dad noticed my refusal, framing it as me being cold or petty. "Why can't you just help me this once?" she'd say, leaning innocently against the counter, while Mom shot me a disappointed look. Every refusal made me feel like I was walking through a minefield, one wrong step away from another accusation. Emily's social life became a stage, and she performed brilliantly. She'd casually mention nights out with friends I didn't know about, new purchases she totally needed, and vacations she'd somehow managed to fund. I heard about it secondhand from family members, who seemed to admire her independence, while continuing to see me as the one who overreacts or takes things too seriously. It stung, and I resented how easily she could charm our family, while I silently carried the weight of responsibility. During one particularly tense dinner, Emily leaned across the table with that infuriating grin and whispered, "You really shouldn't take things so seriously. Life's too short to be so uptight." My parents nodded, subtly reinforcing her point. I forced myself to chew slowly, swallowing the bitter taste of injustice along with my food. Every bite felt like a reminder of how invisible my sacrifices had become, and how quickly my parents could forget the countless times I had bailed her out. A small spark of hope came one evening when a close friend called me, having overheard some of Emily's stories and noticing inconsistencies in her tales about the missing money. "She's not telling the whole truth," my friend said cautiously. The words hit me like a jolt, proof that I wasn't imagining things. Maybe there was a way to expose her, to make the lies stop without destroying my family. But the thought also terrified me. If I moved too early, if I showed any weakness, Emily would twist it again, and I'd lose credibility all over. And as I sat in the dim light of my bedroom, the weight of frustration pressing down on me, I realized the next move would have to be careful, calculated, and deliberate. One wrong step could make everything worse. The tension coiled tightly in my chest, and for the first time in weeks, I began to understand that the quiet game I was playing might be my only chance to regain control, if I could survive Emily's next move. Then came the twist I never saw coming. A week later, a friend, someone who had noticed Emily's odd behavior long before I did, texted me some screenshots. Bank statements, receipts, little messages Emily had sent, all pointing to the fact that she had been secretly siphoning money from the family account for months. My heart raced as I scrolled through the evidence, disbelief and anger colliding in my chest. The proof was undeniable, and yet, my parents were still blissfully unaware, still believing her carefully curated story about how responsible and trustworthy she was. I stared at the phone for what felt like hours, processing the betrayal. All those times I had sacrificed, all those late nights and skipped meals to cover her mistakes, and she had been lying the entire time. Every sense of loyalty and pride I'd held onto suddenly felt twisted, like a weapon turned against me. And the worst part? I realized I didn't have to say anything immediately. I could let the truth simmer, let Emily continue believing she was untouchable, and then strike at the perfect moment. For days, I studied the messages, cross-checking dates and amounts. I began to map out how I could expose her without it backfiring. Emily, oblivious to my silent investigation, continued to flaunt her lifestyle, bragging about new purchases and social outings as if I weren't silently watching every detail. My parents, meanwhile, continued to gush about her charm and cleverness, reinforcing her false image in their minds. But beneath the surface, I felt a spark of empowerment I hadn't experienced in months. For the first time, silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. I realized I didn't need to beg for recognition or try to convince anyone of my truth in the moment. The evidence spoke louder than words ever could. As I closed my laptop that night, the house quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater, I allowed myself a small, bitter smile. Emily thought she was untouchable, that her charm and lies would always protect her. She had no idea the reckoning I was quietly preparing. And as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but feel that the next few weeks would change everything, though I had no idea just how explosive the fallout would be. The days that followed felt heavier than anything I'd experienced so far. Emily seemed to sense a change in me, my silence, my distance, and she began to push harder, testing boundaries I'd carefully erected. Little things at first, a casual jab about me being so uptight, a subtle reminder of all the times I'd supposedly overreacted. But then it escalated. She started leaving pointed notes around the house, messages dripping with passive aggression, as if she were daring me to respond. And my parents, oblivious as always, nodded along, reinforcing her subtle digs without realizing the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. One night, the tension finally cracked. At dinner, she mocked me indirectly, laughing about an incident where she claimed I had been paranoid over money. an incident that was entirely fabricated. Mom glanced at me with that familiar disappointed look. Dad shuffled his fork nervously, and I felt the familiar pang of invisibility and shame press against my chest. The room smelled faintly of reheated pasta, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls, but nothing could mask the humiliation burning inside me. I sat frozen, swallowing every word I wanted to say, knowing that any immediate reaction would be twisted against me. That night, I retreated to my room and let myself finally feel the weight of it all. Years of responsibility, of covering for Emily, of being taken for granted. It all came crashing down. I couldn't stop the tears, couldn't stop the sense of betrayal and exhaustion. I felt like I was watching my life unfold from the outside, powerless to intervene, and the rock-bottom reality hit me. For once, being the responsible one hadn't saved me. It had made me the perfect target. Even in that low, dark space, though, a small ember of determination glimmered. I couldn't let this slide. I couldn't allow years of manipulation to go unanswered. Somewhere beneath the hurt, beneath the shame and the anger, I knew I needed to turn this around. And as I lay in the dim glow of my laptop, scrolling through Emily's messages and receipts, I realized the pieces were falling into place. The storm was coming, and this time, I would be the one controlling it. I started quietly gathering allies, though not the kind Emily would expect. I reached out to a cousin I trusted, someone who had always seen the cracks in Emily's charm and the inconsistencies in her stories. I showed them the evidence I'd collected, bank statements, messages, receipts, and their eyes widened in disbelief. "She's been playing everyone," my cousin said, voice low, almost reverent in its shock. This proves everything." For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of validation, a glimmer that maybe I wasn't completely invisible after all. I also began documenting everything meticulously, creating a timeline of Emily's lies and my financial sacrifices. Each entry, each note, made me feel more in control, as though I were constructing a map that would finally lead to the truth. Emily, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware, flaunting her social outings, her new purchases, and her effortless charm to anyone who would listen. My parents continued to praise her cleverness, completely blind to the manipulation happening right under their noses. I learned to act normal around her, letting her believe her little victories over me were intact, all while preparing for the inevitable reveal. Every casual mention of money, every offhand joke, every sly comment she made was filed away mentally, stored as ammunition for when the moment came. The house still smelled faintly of coffee in the morning, the hum of the heater punctuating the silence. But now, for the first time, that silence was mine. I even started planning subtle ways to introduce the evidence without causing immediate confrontation, leaving receipts casually on the kitchen counter, forwarding statements to my cousin, preparing for the perfect timing when Emily's web of lies could no longer hold. The thought of finally seeing my parents' shock and realization built a quiet, almost tangible anticipation inside me. And as I sat alone one night, the house cloaked in the soft glow of the hallway light, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Power. Emily thought she was untouchable. She thought her lies and charm would protect her forever. But the next move was mine, and she had no idea what was coming. The confrontation had been building in my mind for weeks, and finally, I knew it was time to act. I chose a neutral setting, our living room on a quiet evening, so there would be no distractions, no accidental witnesses, just the three of us, Emily, my parents, and me. I gathered all my evidence, bank statements, receipts, and copies of her messages, laying them out neatly on the coffee table. My hands shook slightly as I did it, but I forced myself to breathe deeply, reminding myself that this was about truth, not emotion. Emily arrived, her usual confident smile in place, completely unaware that the balance of power was about to shift. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, trying to radiate innocence and charm, that carefully constructed persona that had always protected her. "What's all this?" she asked, pretending curiosity. I met her gaze steadily. "It's everything," I said quietly, gesturing to the pile of documents. "Everything you've been hiding from us. The money you've taken, the lies you've told, the debts you made me cover while pretending you were responsible." At first, she laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. "You're kidding, right? You really think this proves anything?" But as I walked her through the timeline, showing transfers, receipts, and messages in order, the laughter faded. Her face paled, her confident demeanor cracking with each revelation. Mom gasped. Dad leaned in, eyes wide, disbelief and shock flickering across their faces. For the first time, I could see that Emily's control over the room was slipping. She tried to twist the story, claiming mistakes, confusion, even suggesting I was fabricating evidence out of anger. But the facts were undeniable. Every document, every date, every message pointed to the same truth. She had been manipulating everyone, while I had been the one covering her mistakes all along. The room was tense, every heartbeat loud in my ears. By the time I finished, silence had taken over. Emily's mouth opened and closed, searching for something to say, anything to reclaim her narrative, but there was nothing. My parents, stunned, looked at me with a mix of guilt and awe. And in that moment, as I watched the truth finally land where it belonged, I realized the reckoning had arrived, and the house, once a place of humiliation and manipulation, finally felt like mine again. But even as Emily sat frozen, her eyes wide with shock, I knew this was only the beginning of seeing how far the consequences would reach. The room stayed silent for what felt like an eternity. Emily's face had drained of color, her eyes wide, mouth opening and closing, like she was searching for words that didn't exist. My parents sat frozen, glancing between the documents and their daughter, struggling to process the truth that had been hidden in plain sight for months. The hum of the heater filled the space, punctuating the tension, and even the faint smell of coffee from earlier seemed to hang heavier in the air. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the culmination of weeks of silent planning finally paying off. Emily tried to speak, a trembling whisper. I didn't mean. But her words fell flat, swallowed by the undeniable evidence on the table. Every transfer, every receipt, every carefully documented message pointed straight back to her. My parents' eyes softened on me for the first time in months. We had no idea, Mom said quietly, her voice heavy with regret. We trusted you, and we didn't see it. Dad reached over, placing a hand on my shoulder. I swallowed the lump in my throat, trying not to let years of frustration spill over, and just nodded. Emily's hand shook as she gathered the scattered papers, her usual confidence gone. You don't understand, she stammered, but the words rang hollow. The truth was laid bare, and there was no room for manipulation, no angle left to defend. For the first time, the balance had shifted. I wasn't the scapegoat anymore. I wasn't the one silently enduring blame while covering for her mistakes. I had the undeniable upper hand, and yet, even as my parents began questioning her, the shock and anger evident on their faces, I stayed composed. I let them see everything, let them draw their own conclusions, knowing that the proof was far stronger than anything I could argue with words alone. Emily slumped into a chair, defeated, the weight of her actions finally catching up to her. As I stood there, watching the moment unfold, a mix of vindication and relief washed over me. This wasn't just a victory, it was a reckoning. And even as Emily tried one last time to salvage her story, I knew the truth had landed permanently, and this time, there would be no lies to twist it back. The aftermath was quiet but heavy. My parents spent hours talking to me, asking questions, trying to piece together what had really been happening. Their apologies came slowly, awkwardly, but they were real. Mom admitted she had blindly trusted Emily's charm. Dad confessed he hadn't paid attention to the patterns right under his nose. It was painful to hear how easily my sacrifices had been overlooked for so long. But finally, they were acknowledging me, not just for exposing the truth, but for years of patience and responsibility that had been taken for granted. Emily, meanwhile, faced the consequences she had long avoided. She had to return the money, own up to the debts she'd hidden, and accept restrictions on her spending. She tried to argue, to charm her way out of it, but this time, no one bought it. Every attempt to manipulate or shift blame fell flat against the mountain of evidence I had quietly gathered. I could see the frustration on her face, the realization that her golden child act had crumbled completely. The house felt different now, lighter in some ways, though still awkward. Conversations with my parents became more honest, less filtered by Emily's interference. They asked for my input, trusted my judgment, and began to see me as an equal, rather than the default, responsible one. I could feel the tension easing slowly, a sense of balance returning after months of manipulation and false blame. I took time to reflect on everything, the resentment, the exhaustion, the humiliation. For the first time, I let myself feel proud, not just for exposing the lies, but for maintaining patience, for strategizing silently instead of letting anger control me. I realized that strength wasn't just about standing up in the moment. Sometimes, it was about waiting for the right time to act, and letting truth speak louder than any argument. And though Emily tried, subtly at first, to regain some of her footing, I maintained boundaries firmly. The lessons were clear. Responsibility was my strength, but silence and strategy were my allies. I had endured. I had survived. And now, for the first time in years, I could breathe. And the house finally felt like home again. But even as I felt that relief, a part of me knew that trust, once fractured, is delicate. The next challenge would be keeping it intact, even as the memory of her lies lingered quietly in the corners of the rooms we all shared. Sitting alone in my room that night, I finally let myself reflect on everything. The years of being overlooked, the endless sacrifices, and the betrayal that had cut deeper than I ever imagined. I thought about how easy it had been for Emily to twist the truth, to manipulate everyone with charm, while I quietly carried the weight of responsibility. And yet, I also recognized how far I'd come. I had reclaimed my voice, exposed the lies, and regained control over my life. There was a sense of empowerment in that realization, a quiet strength that came from knowing I had endured and outlasted the chaos. I spent hours thinking about boundaries, about the lessons learned from trusting blindly, from putting everyone else's needs above my own. I understood now that loyalty doesn't mean letting yourself be used, that silence can be a weapon when wielded with care, and that patience, strategic, calculated patience, can be far more powerful than confrontation fueled by emotion. Emily's antics had revealed not just her character, but mine too. My resilience, my ability to plan, and my unwillingness to let injustice go unchallenged. Even as Emily tried, in small ways, to repair her image or regain trust, I maintained my distance. I offered no forgiveness yet, only boundaries firmly in place, letting her actions speak louder than any words. My parents, now aware and more discerning, supported this shift, acknowledging the lessons we had all learned about responsibility, honesty, and accountability. The household felt different, calmer, more balanced, and safer for me for the first time in years. In the quiet of that evening, I realized something important. Empowerment isn't just about revenge or exposing someone. It's about reclaiming your life, your dignity, and your peace of mind. I had done that. I had survived the manipulation, the lies, and the humiliation, and I had emerged stronger and wiser. And as I looked around the house, the faint hum of the heater, the lingering aroma of evening coffee, the shadows stretching along familiar walls, I felt a sense of closure that had eluded me for years. Emily's deception had ended. My family had seen the truth. And for the first time, I could move forward unburdened, finally at peace in the life I had fought so hard to protect.